Hi, welcome to a Roboflow training movie. In this training movie, I will show an example of how Roboflow can group email notifications and send them out to different users. Out of the box, Roboflow in a hot collection workflow, launches a query, and as a result, this query then returns records, and you can use the standard bundled mail from Roboflow to send an email to a certain fixed email address. But that means if there's, for instance, 100 new records or 100 records you want to report about, this one email gets 100 emails. A list of 100 records in one mail. But imagine that you want a bunch of records to be grouped together. Imagine the scenario that users are uploading files through the internet or adding files to Cumulus, and they add their email address while in that process. And so one of the fields is the email. I'm saying now it's the email. It could be also another field. It could be department, or it could be branch, or whatever. Something that groups them together. Imagine that you want Roboflow to notify you for those groups of files and it wants to send out one email per group. Well, then this is an example of what this workflow will do. I will first run it and then afterwards explain. So when I look here, I have a bunch of records assigned to this email address. I have a bunch of records assigned to this email record. I have a bunch of records assigned to nothing. So I have 3 different email addresses in there that are assigned to records. So 3 different groups. I've enabled in the catalog a Roboflow trigger, and that Roboflow trigger for each new record, which is the example of this scenario, it will write a little XML file in a trigger folder. This I added these records, so automatically it has now created those triggers in the trigger folder, which means that it will process these records. As I said, I only wanted to process the records that have an email address, so it will not process the ones that don't have that email. And when I go to Roboflow and I run the report, I say start. If I look at the log, it says, okay, it has loaded the trigger files, and then it found 30 records. I did. So from those 30 records, it says, okay, I'm finding the first record. And of course, there was no previous record, so this is empty. It says, okay, the previous version, the new version for this record is this. And as long as this value doesn't change, it just continues accumulating information about these records. At some point it comes to a record, this record, and this record suddenly has a different group name. In this case, the group name is the email address, so it has a different email address. It sees the previous one was this one, so it sends to the previous guy the email. In this example, I also added a CC, so this is how you can add CC mail in your Cumulus. I will show it in Roboflow setup. And then it continues accumulating again information about the records from that group until that too changes. And as soon as that changes, As soon as this changes into something else, we go down, down, down. Suddenly it here, where it is here, it changes. So this was all this list, all had this email, and now suddenly the next one has this one. So it terminates this list by sending the email notification to this person, and then it continues. And then it goes all the way to the end, and at the end it sees, okay, it's the final record, so I need to send out my final record, and it sends it to that final list, to that final group. If I look at the email, let's renew the email. I received 2 mails, one sent to pvdp@moksha, and it gave me a list of the records with the email address, well, the group name in this case, and the other one was sent to this guy with a different list of different records. So you can see that it nicely sends out, and the third mail will have gone to my Gmail account. So this is how it looks. How does it work behind the scenes? Well, if you have a look in the workflow, first of all, I'm not using the standard email field because that would use the normal standard bundled mail, but I am using the configuration file. So you can just come in here and define whatever title you want for the mail. You can define whatever layout you want for each individual record. So in my example, I created a table row with the record name and the email address, but whatever cumulus information you want to add, you can add here. And then the body of the mail is the HTML layout of your real mail. So it needs to start with HTML, body, and then end with body HTML. And then whatever you put in between is just standard HTML. So important is that the text of the mail is internally in the workflow stored under this variable. So by adding this here, it brings that text into the mail, which brings then, and so while it is running for each line, it is concatenating this part. And when it finally has to send the mail, it's building up this text by picking up this variable, which was a concatenation of this. And this is the standard way that Roboflow does that also for the normal mail. So you can personalize this as much as you like. You can personalize whatever fields you want. You can personalize the title with placeholders or with just standard text, whatever you need. Then if we look here, what I configured is that I'm using the trigger. I'm working on the cumulus trigger, and on top of that, when the trigger is processed, I'm just putting it into the processed folder. The trigger file is what we saw, what needed to be configured in your properties here, and this is a Roboflow trigger where we just tell it to go to that trigger folder. Then, going back to Roboflow, then I defined a group by field, and the group by field is in this case email address, but as I said before, it could be a different field, a department, whatever, a branch, could be whatever field you want to group by. And I'm using this in the query as well. You could hard code here in the email, in the query, email address has value order by email address. I just used this, so I only have to put this group by field in there once. What might strike you as something unknown is this part. Roboflow, and only Roboflow, allows you to have this order by part in your query, which means that you tell Roboflow to sort the result of your collection. This query, because there is a trigger, is a narrow search, and so it finds the records from the trigger, and then remember these 74 records, it does a narrow search looking for only the records that have a value in the email address field, which ends up with 30 records, and that it orders it by that. So that way the workflow, when it's processing it, it gets them nicely bundled per group. So that's how it's able to get that functionality working. Then there's an email field. In this example, it's the same as that group by field, but it could of course also be something completely different. Could even be that you're using the group field to do a lookup into a table field where you say this department is this person responsible. Then you would just have this extra lookup to be done. And in this example, I showed you that you can have a CC mail, and the CC mail is just actually sticking this email address after the normal address email, but just prefixing it with like this. So in the email address, I just add this in between. Oh, so not semicolon, but colon, which means that Roboflow knows that it's not somebody needs to send a mail to, it just needs to add this person as a CC. Same for BCC, you can do BCC as well. And then if you don't want it to be CC but a real user, then an individual mail. And so as you could see here from the mails, it was CCing it. But if you say, I don't want them to see the CC, I want them just to send also one to there, then you need to change in the Roboflow workflow, you need to remove in the mail instruction that colon CC colon and just replace it by a simple semicolon, and then it will send a separate mail to this address. Technically, how does it work? Well, first of all, what I do is I pick up the files. Remember, if we look here, this is called mail.txt, but in reality, these are in your parameter file, you could see this, 3 files. This is mail.txt, this is subject mail.txt, and this is body mail.txt. So what I'm doing here is those 3 files, I'm defining them as a file object in Roboflow to be able to read them afterwards, and I'm calling them global. I'm prefixing it by global because I don't want to do this each time. I'm just doing this for the first record. What I also do is I store an internal global parameter called previous group, which will be the previous email address. By default, it's nothing. That way I can know when it changes, it can automatically pick up the new value. And the same for the text of the mail. I initialize it also to nothing. Then I'm storing the record field value of what was defined by the group by field in the parameters, which is in this case the email address. So it's picking up the either email address field and it's storing that in the current group. And then it's writing that to the log, so you can see previous and current. And previous is a global one because it needs to, the variable needs to be available throughout the whole workflow. If you don't prefix it like with the current, it disappears in the next for the next record, and it's picked up again by this instruction. Then I'm testing if the previous group equals the current group. If it's not equals, I'm prefixing it with an exclamation mark, so not. If it's not so if I'm encountering a new email address, then I need to send out the email about the previous stuff. Of course, I'm also testing if the email of the previous group was not empty, because that means that we're processing the first record and there was no previous group. So that's why this little extra test. Again, with an exclamation mark, it's not empty. And then I'm reading the text file. I'm parsing the body of the text file to make sure that any automation in there, any scripting in there, tags are evaluated. I'm reading the subject, and then I'm sending the mail. I'm specifying here the email field, which is in the main window. And then this is the little extra thing here, CC, tells Roboflow that it needs to CC this. If you remove this and just put a semicolon, then it will send just 2 individual mails. It picks up the subject and the body and it's sent. And then after this, I'm resetting the text mail to nothing, emptying it. And then I'm also picking up, I'm saying that the previous group becomes the current group to be sure that I can test it in the next record. Then I'm storing a field value, mail text. I'm reading the mail text, sorry, the mail.txt file, and then evaluating it. So I'm picking up the text and I'm gluing it to whatever previous text I have, which is this part which I talked about before, which is actually reading this little text file which returns this, and by parsing it, it automatically evaluates this and turns this into real values. Come on. Then finally, when we get to the last record, then it also has to send out an email for whatever is there for that last record. So it reads the text file again for the body, it evaluates the body, it reads the subject, and then you might wonder, why don't you evaluate the body? Why do you evaluate the body? I just do a tag which just will process any scripting in there. Why don't you do that for subject? Because actually here in the sending of the mail, I'm using that body tag, so I'm not evaluating it anymore. I'm just looking for a stored element, while this will look up that value and will parse it, will evaluate. So, and the same for the subject. So I don't need to pre-process it. It's going to be processed here, but because this is a tag, the tag is just picking up the name and giving a reference to that variable to the workflow, which means that there's no evaluation done. And so that's why there's this little extra step here. So a very long explanation to show you how this can work. It's very straightforward. You just are actually, because you're sorting the results by the group, you're able to nicely send emails grouped. If the customer were to ask, yes, but can also this be sorted alphabetically, then within the group, that would be a sorting within a sorting. That's something that is not possible out of the box. That would require, what you would have to do in that case is you would have to go to an intermediate format somehow, to a text file or to something intermediate, and then an SQL database, and then do the sorting. So you cannot have two levels of sorting in here, and there's just one level of sorting possible out of the box. So thank you for joining this training movie, and hope to see you in the next one.